In 1963, when the crew for Zulu went to film in South Africa, for many of the crew it was the first time in such a remote location. And because this was the era when home movie making was taking off, a lot of the crew brought film cameras with them, 8mm cameras, and they shot a lot of behind-the-scenes footage, showing themselves at work and at play, showing the surrounding area, especially showing the Zulus. There's a great fascination with the Zulu tribal rituals, especially the dance sequence, because it was so spectacular. The film was shot on location in the Drakensberg National Park, quite a remote region in KwaZulu-Natal, and there are very few townships close to the location. And in order to house the crew and to sustain the filmmaking over 3 months of shooting, virtually an entire production village was built very close to the set. And in deliberately choosing to shoot on location at the Drakensberg site, the filmmakers made a conscious decision to turn the land itself into a spectacle, to emphasize the overwhelming power of scenery, to represent the strange and foreign and alien environment in which the soldiers found themselves. And that in itself seems to represent and provide a visual analogy for the power of the Zulu nation. The South African government was very keen to attract overseas filmmakers to the country for location filming. This was the era of apartheid, and South Africa was effectively a pariah nation. But it did offer unique landscapes and unique personnel in the form of the Zulus themselves, of course, in a story about their own history. Endfield was an American director who'd been resident in Britain since the early 1950s, and he began developing his own projects. And he did this partly by associating with the actor Stanley Baker. And Zulu was going to be their epic. This was the big-scale movie that they'd been building up to. Sy then worked with the writer John Prebble in adapting that screenplay, redrafting it, rewriting it, improving it, strengthening it, fleshing it out. The original title of the project had been The Battle of Rorke's Drift, and Sy came up with the title Zulu. Stanley Baker was a young man when this film was made. He was only 35 when he was making this first production for his own company, a very large-scale and ambitious production for a young, untested producer. And playing the leading role at the same time, of course, was an additional pressure on him. So he had quite a difficult balancing trick to pull off. He had to be able to forget his producer's role once he stepped in front of the camera and to immerse himself in the character. He then had to forget that he was an actor once he stepped behind the camera and to become a producer again. And the efficiency of the production, the fact that it was made within budget, only a week over schedule for the location scenes, and that entirely due to circumstances beyond his control, this is a testimony to Baker's abilities, his ability to combine the role of actor and producer. When Sy and Stanley came to cast the role of Lieutenant Bromhead, they wanted a young star in the making. One was a young actor called Michael Caine, who was appearing in a play in the West End, which was seen by Sy Endfield and Stanley Baker. He was brought in initially to read for the role of Private Hook. When he came to the audition, that part had already been cast, and Endfield said, "Can you do an upper-class accent?" And Caine said, of course I can do an upper-class accent. And he was given a screen test. Caine didn't hear anything. He assumed that he'd lost the part. But he bumped into Endfield at a party. And Endfield said, "You've got the part." And Endfield and Baker took a chance on him. Once he appeared on camera, it was very clear that something really special was happening on screen. The biggest star in the movie in 1964 was Jack Hawkins, who had appeared as the main star of The Cruel Sea, the film in which Stanley Baker had made his first big impression on the screen. And I think it was Baker returning a favour in casting Hawkins in the part of the Reverend Wit. He was really casting him against type, because Hawkins typically played the sort of upright, reliable military officer that Chad himself represents. So he's really being cast against the grain of his usual screen persona. Most of the actors were young, up-and-coming theatre actors who had not yet had a big break and who had not been seen very often on the screen before. One of these was Ivor Emanuel, who was a Welsh tenor who had been popular on stage and on television, but who'd not made a film. Ivor Emanuel was a good friend of Stanley Baker, and Baker needed someone who was able to sing for a key role in the film. Rather than persuade a more experienced actor, Baker offered this to his friend Ivor, who accepted. James Booth had made a big impression on the West End stage, and he was sought out for the role of Private Hook and was offered this plum supporting role. However, he was not taken on location to South Africa with the rest of the crew. Along with 6 or 7 other actors, he filmed all of his scenes in the studios at Twickenham, partly because most of his scenes are interiors anyway, and it made sense to shoot indoors in a British studio, partly because it would have raised the expense of taking another half dozen actors overseas. Perhaps the actor that makes the biggest impression on audiences, and certainly did on reviewers at the time, was Nigel Green. Nigel Green was not a major figure. He was not a well-known supporting player. He was cast as Colour Sergeant Bourne, partly because Stanley Baker's friend Donald Houston had turned it down, and partly because he was able to act older than his real age. He was only 39 when the film was made, and he's playing a character who's supposed to be in his mid-50s. And he's such an amazing presence on the screen. He has such charisma, such authority, that many people feel that he is the strongest performance in Zulu. One of the most memorable moments in Zulu is the first time we hear the Zulus approaching Rorke's Drift. As Michael Caine says, it sounds like a train in the distance. And that's exactly what it was. The sound editor, Rusty Koppelman, used a kind of deep thunder rumble as the base of the track, but he overlaid on top of that not just the sound of assegais beating on shields, but of an actual train running over rails, in order to give this kind of repetitive mechanical beat. So what you're hearing in that sequence is a combination of several different sound effects, very cleverly combined into one. Endfield was an extraordinary man. He was able to work some magic in turning what was actually a very low-budget film into a large-scale epic, in his use of the Zulu extras. There were very few Zulu extras. There were nothing like the 4,000 that were supposed to be there. There were in fact usually only around 240 at any one time. And yet you think you've seen 1,000, 2,000 at once because of the skill in composition and editing. Most of the battle took place at night in the hours of darkness. And of course the film shows most of the battle taking place in the day, and only about 5 or 10 minutes take place at night. And there are obvious logistical reasons for this. If that had been shot entirely at night, it would have been extremely arduous for the crew to shoot. The scenes which do take place at night were shot over a single night during the 3-month shoot. The burning of the hospital was accomplished in the course of that night, and they could have rebuilt it and started again and reshot it if they needed to, but fortunately they shot very efficiently and didn't need to do that. It would also, I think, have been extremely dull for audiences to see an entire battle taking place at night. The scale and spectacle of the battle comes partly from the landscape, which of course needs to be illuminated by day. So I think the filmmakers made a very sensible decision, both creatively and logistically, to shoot the battle scene during the day. The climax of the battle takes place in the early hours of dawn, and this is really beautifully built up by the rising of the sun, by the colouring of the sky, by the misty quality of the characters silhouetted against the dawning light, beautifully accomplished by the cinematographer Stephen Dade. Using real light, there is very little artificial illumination in the film. The film, I think, stands the test of time partly because it has a subtext of skepticism about imperialism. It is not a flag waver, it is not a gung-ho patriotic movie endorsing all the values of imperialism and warfare. It's got a sense that maybe we ought not to be here. Maybe we're not meant to be in this land. Maybe they're right and we're wrong. None of this comes to the surface in the form of a message. This is not a message film, it's not a political film in that sense. But there is a current of unease, of uncertainty, of doubt running through the whole film about imperialism, about warfare, about interracial violence, which makes it strangely modern, and which still, I think, appeals to audiences today.
Diamond Films, the company that made Zulu, was a company set up with Stanley's great friend, the American director Cy Endfield. I don't think they had any properties when they first started, but Stanley really wanted to move on to become a producer, and that was through the director Joe Losey. He worked in 4 or 5 films with Joe, but Joe taught him about production, and he really wanted to produce films. Stanley met Cy when Cy came over to England. He came to London not really knowing anyone at all, and they bonded very closely together. Stanley was working with another American director. They liked Stanley. American directors found him very, very easy. Maybe it was the whole Welsh thing, that he wasn't stuffy English. I don't know.
I think that everybody really, when we started the company, wanted to have a theme of films that were like the old film of All Quiet on the Western Front that was shot in 1937-38. And this was one of the scripts that they felt would be on that vein. Anti-war, and opposite to the Red Indians falling off the horses by the dozen, that both sides were just as frightened of one another as the other. To the best of my recollections, Stanley told me that Doug Rankin, who was a friend of theirs, had read an article by John Prebble that was in a magazine about the Battle of Rorke's Drifts. And they read it, liked it, and then got together with Cy Endfield and John Prebble, and that's where the script came from.
John was a Fleet Street journalist. He was given a job by Lord Beaverbrook on the strength of the first book he wrote while he was in the army. When he came back at the end of the war, he got a job in Fleet Street. And he wrote a series of articles on courage, and it was very successful. He was asked if he could extend the series by 2 or 3 more articles, and he was a bit stuck to know where to go, and I suggested that he should try a book on VCs, which the London Library had, and he found Rorke's Drift in there and used that for that series. He then went on to write a shorter article for Lilliput magazine, and that was the article that was bought to make the film.
Raising the finance was the easiest part of the film. Stanley had done the most dreadful film called Sodom and Gomorrah for Joseph E. Levine, and Joe adored Stanley, and we were in Rome finishing the film. He had the script of Zulu with him, which he would show to everyone, and Joe Levine said, "Stanley, if there's anything you'd like to do, give it to me first." And Stanley produced the script called Zulu, and he immediately, Joe said, "Well, you can have Pearl, she's a darn nice girl, but I'll have Zulu, I'll do it." And Stanley said, "Don't you want to read the script?" He said, "No, I can sell the title."
And after a lunch, I think it was in the Dorchester or somewhere, a very good lunch, they were persuading Joe, and the conversation finished up in the toilet, where Joe agreed on one condition, that we all washed our hands before we shook hands on the deal. So that's where it was really sealed that day, in the toilet of a grand hotel somewhere. The original budget was around 2.6 million. But he said that if we could shoot it around 2 million or under 2 million, there's no question about it that he would honor his commitment and finance us.
Cy Endfield. Well, the Zulus used to call him the Elephant, because they gave everybody names. Stanley Baker was the Tiger, I think. Michael Caine was the Wolf. But anyhow, Cy Endfield was the Elephant. Well, but he certainly ran a lovely, relaxed, but very authoritative ship. He didn't like anybody messing about, but as an actor, you didn't like to do it this way, Cy, say, all right then, let's chat it through, and we'll do it that way. And of course, he's an old American director from way back. So that my main memory of him is a sort of almost like a big daddy. He used to come. And for me, Zulu was virtually my first proper film. I've done a lot of theatre, and it was a marvellous introduction, because Cy was very sensitive to artists, and so, good guy was Cy.
My main memory of director Cy Endfield is that he was a conjurer, and he wanted to be David Copperfield. So while we were making the movie, he was inventing all kinds of really extraordinary conjuring tricks. And most of the time, he didn't seem to be directing a bloody movie at all. Except he would suddenly come, we'd finish the scene, he'd say, great, 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 have you seen this trick? And then he would get a whole bunch of pennies and run them around in his finger, and they'd go, choop, they'd all be gone. And then he'd say, oh, by the way, that was great, he'd say. So, he was some sort of weirdo genius.
Well, he's very, very keen to portray the Zulus in a good light. It wasn't, you have, in some American films, you have the directors that show the Indians in a poor light. And he was very interested in showing them in a true light as they were, the warriors, and showing their ability and their culture.
I tell you what he was great at. He was great at making commercials. And I think that's actually how he made most of his money, directing television commercials. Because I think he was one of the first people in this country, one of the first directors that actually made television commercials. You know, being an American, they'd been making them for years and years and years. But in this country, it didn't start until commercial television, I think, whenever that was in the 50s. And Cy was in at the beginning of all that. Well, now, Stanley Baker was one of my very, very best friends and godfather to two of my children. Stanley Baker was one of the best men I know. He was a real tough old sod, Welsh mining stock. His father was a very tough man who'd been a coal miner and lost his leg in a mine accident, you know? So Stanley was brought up in a sort of in a miner's house where they really didn't have enough to eat.
Now, everybody thought of Stanley as a hard man and a hard nut, but really and truly, underneath all that face was a very kind and very considerate man. And never once did he break his word. We had no contract together for 12, 13 years, and never once did he ever renege on any monies due to me, any part of profits or whatever. One couldn't ask for a better business partner.
The problems of being a first-time producer, particularly when you're setting off on a large American film, are enormous. He'd never done it before, but I was amazed. I was absolutely amazed at his talent for being a producer. I didn't like it. I married an actor. I was an actress who married an actor, and I thought, oh my God, I don't really like producers. But he was tremendously good as a producer, and actors adored working for him.
Stanley had a reputation in the business of being a bit Jack the Lad and always there with the boys and boozing and chatting and joking, but he was very much aware of the fact that he had a tight ship to run, and so that it was a mix, actually, because yes, there was still, as it were, shades of the old Stanley Baker, but also one was very aware of Stanley Baker, the producer.
Stanley's strength as an actor, it's very difficult to say what his strengths were, because he was so different as a person to the characters that he played. He started his career playing villains, which were always the most interesting parts to play, and it was Laurence Olivier who changed that on Richard III. He said Stanley had an Alexander Korda contract, as did Olivier. And when Richard III was being made, Olivier said, "You've had it so easy, Stanley. Villains are very easy to play. You're now going to play Richmond in a blonde wig. You're going to look like Ellen." and that really changed his whole career from villains to leading men, to the hero. And Stanley was doing a film called A Healing Career, and Michael Caine was playing a tiny part. He was very young. There were lots of lovely actors on that film, and we became friends of his. And when it came to Zulu, Michael was in a play at the Arts Theatre, and I think the play was called Next Time I Sing For You. I'm not quite sure what it was called. We went to see it, and Paramount were pressing for Terence Stamp. Terence Stamp was a star. They lived together. That was what was so difficult. Michael and Terry, the two boys in the 60s, tearing up London, these two beautiful boys. And there were only two tests made, Terry and Michael. Michael's was not a good test. It really wasn't. Terry's was very, very professional. But both Stanley and Cy knew that it had to be Michael, and Stanley said he's going to be a massive star. Paramount and Joe Levine fought this from the beginning to the end. They wanted Stanley to sack him all the way through the making of the film. But actors know actors, and that's all the producers don't. Certainly he didn't. And it was quite clear that Michael was going to be a big star.
Because I had friends in high places, I already had the part of Hook. I mean, it was a shoo-in. Stanley was my mate, and he said, "You want to play Hook?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Okay, you're doing it." So Michael came along to play Hook because he was a a Cockney. Was supposed to be a Cockney. He wasn't a Cockney, really. He came from South London, you know. As he's tall and very handsome and blonde, Enfield wasn't lumbered with all the class system that we have in our country. They didn't realise there were posh actors and middle-class actors and lower-class actors. So he thought that Michael looked like a posh actor. So he said to Stanley, couldn't he play Bromhead? And Stanley said, no, he comes from bloody Bermondsey. I mean, he's Del Boy. So he said, but he looks like Bromhead. He looks like an aristocrat. And as Bob Stevens was going to play the part and had turned it down, the silly sod, Michael got the part. So that's show business. 1 minute you go for a little part, the next minute you play the lead.
He, funnily enough, was worried about that part because it was kind of stretched for Michael. I mean, in that, because Michael, I thought Alfie was a marvellous thing for Michael because it was almost him. But the officer in Zulu, he was quite a character stretch for her, and I know when he was making it, he was a bit worried. He kept saying, well, if I'm all right in this film, it's going to be good for me, but he always sort of had that slight reserve things that, well, maybe I won't be all right. Of course, he was all right. He came over beautifully, and it all worked splendidly for him.
Michael was one of those people that you could put roller skates on him and pull him past camera doing 12th Night, and then pull him back the other way, and he could do as you like it, you know. He's a professional. There's no itty-bitties about him and high dungeons and getting himself into a sweat. He just does his job and goes back to his dressing room.
We didn't know anybody, really. We were just setting it up, and it'd been raining, and we were all in a hut. There was a lot of people smoking, and I don't smoke. So when the rain stopped, I came out, went for a walk, and I was walking along, and somebody walking in the opposite direction. And when we got closer, I moved over, because we're on the same line. He moved over, so I moved back again, so did he. So now I know he's doing it on purpose. And so when the person came right up to close to me, I didn't say anything, I just looked at him for him to say something. He said, "You don't remember me, do you?" And I looked at him, I said, "Oh, quite frankly, no, I don't." He said, "Well, you're the man who gave me my first job in the film industry." It was Michael Caine.
I played Private Hook, known to everybody as Hooky, who, written in the script as a kind of ne'er-do-well, you know, layabout who didn't obey orders and shouldn't really have been in the army at all, you know. And I think that if the battle hadn't have started, they would have elbowed him out of the army and shipped him back to Blighty pretty quickly. But but as the battle started while he was in the hospital, his sort of East End toughness and his rapport with his mates around him took over, and he fought with the best of them, you know, like he was fighting in a gang down the East End, you know, getting the blade out and shoving it in whoever was in the way.
John didn't play with history. He wanted to be as true to it as he could, but on the other hand, there was a need to dramatize, and he needed one bad character in it, and made Hook that character. That wasn't altogether, obviously, to the pleasure of Hook's descendants.
We had letters from Hook's family who complained about the way I played the character. They said, actually, Private Hook, who eventually became Regimental Sergeant Major Hook for the South Wales Borderers, was a good, God-fearing Welsh Baptist and never swore, never drank, never cursed, never did anything that our Hooky would have ever done. But they sent me a photograph of him, and he was a really sort of big, pompous, Victorian sergeant major with a big bushy moustache, you know, with a paste stick under his arm, with things all up here, but he was not like the layabout that I played.
Joe Pell had a marvellous military history. I think he was in the SAS or one of the special corps during the war. And they started a stunt team with Captain Jock Easton, I think, that was in the army with him. And Joe came to be one of the stuntmen, but again, to cut down on costs, Joe finished up as Sergeant whatever on the film. And a damn good job he did of it too.
I played Sergeant Windridge, but I never ever tried to be an actor. I thought I'd sooner be proficient as a stunt artist. And so I always avoided any dialogue. But Stanley Baker convinced me that I should play it. And then I got into it. I quite enjoyed doing it. But unfortunately, I got bitten by a poisonous spider or something and finished up in hospital for a fortnight. And unfortunately, during that fortnight, was at the time when I should have been doing the dialogue. So you see very little of me in that part.
We finished up going up to the Drakensberg, which is a great big range of mountains that runs around Botswana. And suddenly, as we came round the corner of one of these locations, this enormous, that looked like an opera background of a castle standing up there on the skyline. And I went, God almighty, this is it.
We got sunny days every day. I don't think we lost a day from, or maybe we lost a morning for clouds or something. It was beautiful, clear sun.
The location was amazing. We were out there for 14 weeks, and because we were away so long, we set up a school. Bob Porter's children, Cy Enfield's children, and we took all the schoolwork, and they kept up to standard.
We built a Talk of the Town, which was the favourite restaurant in London at the time, for the crew to eat and drink from, and all the facilities for cooking and props and this, that, and the other. And even though we only used pups and small lights on the film, we bought an ex-army generator, enormous great thing, and we were able to take it away 300 or 400 yards away from the actual shooting site, and we dug it into the ground with pipes and what have you for soundproofing. But there's a great end story to it, because halfway through the shoot, we woke up in the middle of the night and the generator was on fire. And we all rushed to see what was going on. And we'd set this generator on a coal seam. And it wasn't the generator on fire, it was the coal seam underneath the ground. And it took us about 2 days to put out the coal seam of coal underneath the ground. The original budget was 2.6 million. And we had to get it down to 2. And after I had studied the budget and what have you, and the costs of sets and the costs of costumes, for example, a thing from Berman's, we'll say from here in London, for each Zulu's costume was about £300 or £400 a piece. And some of the sets that were being offered to us by set designers in Africa were very costly. So I could see that the only way to cut down on the budget by doing all these things ourselves.
It was a low-budget picture. If it had been any more, it would never have got made, so? And so Stanley got all his mates in the cast, and that's how it got made so cheaply. I figure that if they'd taken me and Paul Daneman and Pat McGee and people to South Africa, they would have had to pay our fares to South Africa. They would have had to pay us a per diem, feed us, put a roof over our head, and give us some pocket money to lay about in, to lay about when we're not shooting, you know. And equity being equity, in those days you had to pay first-class fares for actors. I really loved Twickenham Studios. It was a nice, intimate little studio. We had our hospital built there. Boozer was across the road.
When we got to Africa and we saw the Zulus for the very first time, the way we met them, they did the charge. And I stood there with my children who were absolutely terrified, and they stopped 2 feet from us and did the stamping, and it quite terrifying. I'm not surprised armies ran away from them.
I think that the Zulus initially were suspicious of us as to whether we were trying to make them, you know, not be particularly good at fighting or whatever. But then after a while they realised that we weren't doing that, and they were enthusiastic to actually get in and work with us.
But it was a horrible time to be there. Sharpeville had happened the week before, apartheid, and where we were, of course, with the Afrikaans, the white Afrikaans people. It was the worst of apartheid. And being a Liberal, being a great Liberal, it was quite shocking. But we were there. We were there to work, We were in their country, so you obeyed the rules. Secret police were there on the set the whole time. It was very difficult. Stanley became a very, very skilled politician. He handled it beautifully.
In that time, the apartheid was still very strong, and that scene we didn't dig very much. We misbehaved ourselves. We was going to have a glass of beer with them and things like that, which you weren't supposed to do and all that rubbish. But that was the only downside of it. That was a little bit of a damper on it.
You weren't allowed to pay them the going equity rate. The government wouldn't let you. We had to get around that other ways. So Stanley gave them 300 head of cattle. He gave them the buildings. The location units were beautifully built. They became schools and hospitals for the Zulus. We were able to do that for them. We weren't allowed to fraternize or mix with them in any way, shape, or form. I was slightly because of the children, and Glim was allowed for 2 hours to have his 6th birthday party with the Zulu children, but it was very regulated.
The South African government in Pretoria at the time really didn't approve of us, if you like, making the Zulus into heroes, or putting them on par with us as the white soldiers.
Tom Jones had just had It's Not Unusual. Why we had it in our luggage, I'll never know, but Stanley adored Tom. And again, so well, she was going to say, this man's going to be the biggest star. And we played it to the Zulus. And we would be on one side of the stream, and they would be on the other side, and we had all the loudspeakers, and then we would twist, we would dance, all of us, the children as well, to this one record, It's Not Unusual, and then they would dance the other side, and they were twisting before we left. Oh, that was lovely. I have marvelous memories of that. One of the great things about the Zulus was we started the film, and we had the most unseasonable weather that ever was. It was snowing ice balls. The sky never lifted, and it's a continuous action, the film, so it had blue skies the whole time. And the days went on, and we got to the 6th day, the 7th day, no work had been done, the camera hadn't turned at all, and the Zulus decided to send the witch doctor in to see if he could lift the weather for the unit. So this guy came, and I took the children, and he had all his feathers and his bones coming out of his nose and everything, and he had these bones in a bag, and he laid them on the floor of the unit where the set was being built. And then he had chalk marks, and he put extraordinary chalk marks. We were absolutely terrified. We never touched them all the way through the filming. We thought it would bring us bad luck. Nothing happened. The weather continued to be very bad, and on the 12th day, Stanley was in despair. We were over 2 weeks behind, and not one shot had been done. So I got up at 4:30 in the morning, and I mean, it was hallelujah. The sky, the dawn was wonderful. I rushed, I said to Stanley, get up, darling. I rushed to Endfield, barged into their bedroom, get up, Si, get up. I rushed all around the hotel like a banshee, banging on every single door, and then I went and made an enormous pot of tea. There was nobody in the hotel kitchen, it was 20 to 5, and then it started. But there was a benefit. There was a benefit. Because the weather was so bad, they rehearsed. They rehearsed all the battle scenes, and that was choreography. So that the Zulus knew what they were doing, our lot knew what we were doing, and they made up those 2 weeks within the first month of filming. It just went like clockwork from that moment onward.
We used to take the Zulus off away from the main unit and rehearse the scenes that were next to be shot. The idea being that if the director would tell us what he wanted, we go away and rehearse it. So when it came back, it saved a lot of time. Instead of rehearsing in front of camera, it was rehearsed away from camera, come back and they could shoot it, and it speeded the whole thing up.
The dance sequence was really, because by that time Garsha Buthelezi were there, because he was playing Catch a Whale. So Bart Garsha and his advisors, they really set up the dance sequence as it would be for Si to direct as a director. But they were the one who advised him on what they did and what they didn't do.
Chief Buthelezi, of course, was a highly intelligent man. His mother was the paramount chief. But Buthelezi had been educated in England. He went to Sandhurst, so he was very familiar with with English ways on society, and highly intelligent man who spoke perfect English, and it was wonderful to deal with him. He's in the film, of course. He plays Chetawaya in the film. And very dignified family. And yes, they were treated differently by the government, very specially. So Stanley became enormous friends of Buthelezi. And when Stanley died, I had a magnificent wreath and a letter, and he actually said he was the finest white man he'd ever met. I don't know if anybody's told you, they'd never seen a movie. They didn't recognize what a camera was. And this was incredibly difficult, rehearsing them, because they didn't know what they were rehearsing to, this strange machine. So it was Stanley who had the idea, and it was wonderful. They sent down to Johannesburg for silent movies. Harold Lloyd, Laurel and Hardy, and who else? Buster Keaton, who they adored. A rock was painted white, and every night we had a film show. Well, we all went to it, and their delight, and they were highly intelligent. They knew exactly then what they had to do.
So Stanley and I went up there with a couple of muskets, Henry Martini rifles with blanks, and I would go out in front pretending to be a Zulu, with a spear and a shield, which of course the Zulus loved because I obviously didn't hold it properly or do anything properly with it. And as I advanced on Stanley, Stanley would shoot me with a blank, and I would go over in a stuntman's death fall that you've seen a million times.
And the trick was to stop them acting to camera. I don't know, in the film, they throw themselves and the spears go in them and they lurch down from trees. And you have to say, stop overacting. They were amazing.
We didn't actually have as many Zulus as we wanted. We shot the whole film with about 500 Zulus. And this was a problem. When we were doing the scenes with the Zulu impis coming over the hills, we didn't have enough Zulus. So our prop man had the brilliant idea. He took a batten of wood and nailed 10 shields on this batten and put plumes over the top. And then we put a live Zulu at each end. So for every 2 Zulus, we had 12. But if you look really, really hard, you can see that 10 of them haven't got any legs. When we had to do the fight sequences and everything, well, of course, staging fights, you are very much in each other's hands, as it were, because their assegais were real, and all those firearms were real, and the bayonets, there was no fake rubber bayonets or anything like that, so we all had to work it out pretty carefully that nobody actually got seriously hurt, and to the best of my knowledge, nobody was seriously hurt. A few little scratches and bruises and things.
There weren't any really main stunts, as I call stunts. The point was that it was all action scenes, all fight scenes, really, not individual stunts.
Bodies would be falling.
Get shot or speared in the action.
They were all wonderfully drilled, wonderfully drilled. As I was wounded fairly early on, in the battle sequences, in fact, I was shot. And so, in fact, apart from doing my heroic bit, which I did, which I got the VC for, which is carrying around the ammunition whilst wounded, I didn't actually have to do any cut and thrust of fighting, but just drag this ammunition box around, which was not too arduous. My costume consisted of a bandage with this great puddle of blood in the middle of it. They keep rushing in and refreshing. It wasn't a very comfortable costume, actually, but there you go. And also, that was the other, talking about costumes, too, there was a lot of very serious wounds in there. And, of course, once these wounds are done, like assegai sticking in chests and half a hook thrust to it, the artist had to keep these on. So you put you off your lunch, you know. You'll be sitting down there with somebody with an eye dropping out and something else. And that's the guy sticking in. Oh, and I have a double-egg and chips for you.
Hot. No, listen, everybody knows that movies are phony. What they do, they get some gel, petroleum jelly, on a brush, and they paint everything with petroleum jelly. And then they set fire to it, and it all flares up, and they get some smoke, and they pump it in, and they say, run through that. Mind you, don't get your ass burned. And, it looks good. The problem, of course, was with the Zulus, we're almost naked. And we also had feathers around here and things. It was fun when you're boys playing as soldiers.
Johnny Gibson really deserves marvellous applause, really, for the way he cut the picture, because he would work with me as a second unit director, and if he was short of a cut to get into something or whatever, he would take me in the cutting room, show me where something was missing, and ask me if I'd go out and do something that would actually cut into that sequence to keep the rhythm going.
When you see all the disjointed bits that he had to turn into charges, fights, I think they're actually the battle sequences, and the advance from fire was part of the success of the movie, I think.
When the film was finished and it was being put together, and we were enormously proud of it, I think everybody knew by then there was something very, very special. And Stanley showed it to Richard, who was staying at the Dorchester at the time, and asked him if he would do the narration, and there was no problem at all. Richard came down to Twickenham and did it in an afternoon. I love John Barry's music for Zulu. I think that those opening sounds are absolutely wonderful. And when John does come to London and does his music at the Albert Hall, I have been a few times, and the audience really do respond to the themes of Zulu. They love it, they cheer.
John Barry listened to all this Zulu music, and the theme of Zulu came out of those, of the original indigenous Zulu music. And in fact, the music of Zulu, I think, nearly earned as much money as the film, because it was a tremendous success.
The film was at the Plaza, and the premiere was, as ever, at the Grosvenor House. Everybody goes to the Grosvenor House to have their film premiere in those days. And John Barry had composed the Zulu stamp.
I remember Ivory Manuel singing. And what else? I remember drinking a lot of champagne and having a great party. And what a big success it was.
Unbelievable success. I mean, you couldn't believe, I think in the first 2 or 3 weeks, we were practically home and dry from the point of view of the cost of the picture. We were, at the time, the biggest box office take that England had ever had.
We were on cloud nine. This was Stanley's first production. There were 2 other films that were taking a lot of money in January. Hard Day's Night with the Beatles and a Bond film. And every night we went to the Plaza to look at the queues, every single night. It was a very thrilling time.
He took some of us to see the film, and in a deprecating manner, he, at intervals, said to me the scriptwriter should have made more of that scene, and the scriptwriter should have cut that bit of dialogue, and the scriptwriter should have done this, that, and the next thing. And eventually a man sitting behind him tapped him on the shoulder and said, "If you think you could write a script like this, laddie, you should try."
Stanley was an incredibly fit person. I mean, he really was very physical. He loved sports and everything. And there didn't appear to be any deterioration, but there was. And it was in 1974 that I noticed, and he was only, 45, that he was slowing up. And I just thought, well, he's packed in an awful lot into his life. He's only 45, he's made 87 films. It's been a hard life, and we didn't take any notice. And he missed a Wales-England international. I went instead to Twickenham, and I thought he really must be ill to be watching this. That was January the 17th. He was operated on a few days later. It was just there. It was cancer of the lung that had spread, and he died after 20 weeks. Zulu is a classic film and has become more so. I mean, what is it now? Nearly 40 years?
People like it. I mean, you're wandering around the streets, say, "Oh, Zulu's on tonight, oh, I can't come down the pub."
People still remember me from then. They even actually recognize me, which I find strange.
People have a great love of Zulu. I've been all over the world, and people have come up to me and said, "It's my favorite film."
To some blokes, it is almost a way of life.
I've never worked it out, but it works. This is a film that works. And of course, being a period film in costume, it won't date.
One of those films that will go on and on and on.
I get letters from all over the world. There are clubs in America, clubs in Canada. I've given every bit of memorabilia I've ever had, and I did have a lot of memorabilia. It's all gone.
My grandchildren, when they see it, they think that my eldest son, Matthew, they say there's Uncle Matthew. They don't realise it's old Grandpa.
He always used to say that he thought he'd bored more people at Christmas time than anyone else alive because it was always being shown at Christmas.
I've seen the film hundreds of times, and I always think, I'll watch it for 10 minutes, and then you get right through to the end.
The ending, the last scene in the film, for me and for everybody else, I think, summed up the awfulness of war in any description, in any situation. This picture was made without any bias towards the black or the white. There was no razzmatazz and waving of the band with the British. It wasn't a question of who was brave and who wasn't brave. Both sides were exactly the same.
Even to stand there, even if you have got rifles and they've got spears, just to actually stand there in the face of that mass is a feat of incredible, incredible courage.